Can everybody hear me? Just to
Yes.
be sure?
Morning.
Yes? Okay, that's great. Well, good morning. My name is Paco Pangalangan. I'm the Executive Director of Stratbase ADR Institute. Uh, First of all, I'm really honored to be welcoming you all here today to our virtual roundtable discussion entitled Debunking China's New Normal, a year after the readback incident. We have a packed schedule, a packed program for this morning. So I think the best thing for me to do really now is to pass you on to Professor Dean Dumanhit, our president and the president of Stratbase ADR Institute, so that he can formally give you the opening remarks. Professor Manhit. Professor Manhit, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute. There we
Can I be
go.
heard now?
Yeah. Yes, loud and clear.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to Stratbase Albert Rosario's Institute's virtual roundtable, which we have entitled Debunking China's New Normal, a year after the readback incident. Allow me to welcome everyone by stating where we stand as an institute, that despite the global health emergency caused by this virus from Wuhan, China, China continued to pursue its territorial expansionism in the region. And since the official announcement of COVID-19, China has taken its regional security agenda further by even establishing administrative districts in South China Sea, escalating confrontations with the Philippines, Japan, Malaysia, sinking even a Vietnamese fishing vessel, and even creating tension in its shared land border with India. Tolerating this normalization of China's security interests, which extends beyond traditional security, creates an imbalance of multipolar interest in the region and violates established international laws and norms. While as a nation, we simultaneously grapple with this pandemic and China's maneuvering in the South China Sea, we are all reminded of how, exactly a year ago, June 9, 2019, 22 Filipino fishermen were left to die after China's fishing vessel rammed into an anchored FB Gemver 1. And it reminds my colleagues and I in the Institute of what we have tracked since 2016. So allow me to show the timeline of what we have been seeing through the years since 2016. It's quite sad that our own government seems to be silent about all these actions. It's not even leading initiatives within the region to make a stand on this issue. So from 2016 to 2017, 2018, a lot of these incidents, actions by China. And here we are now in 2020, dealing with this pandemic, dealing with this virus. And what we see is that we need to debunk this China's new normal. The aggressive moves are not unprecedented and seems to be consistent with Chinese statecraft that relies on the abuse of any strategic opportunity to expand geopolitical interests relative to other claimant states in the disputed matters. That's why we believe that amid this global pandemic, we, not only as an institute, but we as a people, as a nation, must keep our guards up. We must enforce our territorial integrity in the West Philippine Sea, defend our maritime rights in accordance with international law. While there is a global initiative to defeat COVID-19, which is an invisible foe, there must be a united stand in the Philippines and generate support within the region to promote a rule-based order. We should not be blindsided by China's aggression and expansionism as we cope with the pandemic crisis. As of this morning, we had a registration of over 550 people. So again, I welcome them. Good morning to all, and thank you for joining us in this virtual roundtable. Paco, I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Professor Manhit. Now let's move on to our none other than Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, who's our chairman at Stratbase ADR Institute and is, as we all know, the former secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, who's here, who's joined us today to give us his keynote address for the event. Ambassador Del Rosario, the floor is yours. Ambassador Del Rosario, you have to unmute. You'll have to unmute yourself on the Zoom. There you go.
Are we okay now?
We are okay.
Okay, thank
yes,
you very much, Paco. Thank you very much, Lindo. Good morning to everyone. As the world struggles with the COVID-19 pandemic, today reminds us that it has been exactly a year after agents of the Chinese state rammed into a small wooden fishing boat called the FB Gemver 1 in the Reed Bank, manned by our fellow countrymen who were only there fishing for a living. This terrible incident should not be forgotten in our national memory, as it is a tangible fragment of China's bigger design of atrocity to control the entire South China Sea. Just last April this year, and in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, agents of the Chinese state again rammed and sunk a Vietnamese vessel near the Paracels, reminding us of what happened to our countrymen a year ago. Thankfully, our Department of Foreign Affairs saw it fit to issue a statement of solidarity with our Vietnamese neighbors, recalling that it was our Vietnamese friends and who helped save the lives of our distressed Filipino fishermen of FB Gemver 1 in the Reed Bank. The moment we forget is the moment we cave in to persistent Chinese atrocity. It is the moment we lose ourselves as Filipinos. The act of remembering is crucial in order for us to stand up for our rights in the face of persistent bullying and injustice. As we celebrate Independence Day on June 12th, we need to be reminded of this fundamental principle, that we Filipinos must always remember to stand up for our rights. China does not see us as having equal rights. China pretends to be a friend while seizing our territory, reclaiming and building artificial islands on our land and waters, harassing our soldiers and ramming our fishermen. These acts are too atrocious to be brushed aside in favor of loans and investments, which at this time remains to be promises. Have we as Filipinos reached this point that our sovereignty can simply be bought? Last July 12, 2016, as a firm believer in the rule of law, Filipinos vindicated their rights against the continuing abuses of China in the West Philippine Sea through the UNCLOS Arbitration Award won in The Hague. Part of this award is the unanimous finding that China inflicted the most massive, near-permanent, and devastating destruction of the marine wealth belonging to Filipinos in the West Philippine Sea. In other words, China owes Filipinos billions of pesos for its continuing abuses in the West Philippine Sea. More than half of our country's 110 million Filipinos live in coastal communities, relying on marine resources for their daily needs. As highlighted by Justice Tony Carpio and Senator Risa Hontiveros, our country's scientists at the University of the Philippines Marine Science Institute conservatively estimated that our country is losing at least 33.1 billion annually from our damaged reef ecosystems due to China's reclamation activities and illegal fishing operations. This sums up, ladies and gentlemen, to well over 230 billion since the pesos, at least pesos, since the start of 2014, around the time China started dredging until this year. China refuses to pay its debt to the Filipino people. So that said, how will we make China pay? First, we believe China officials, first to make China officials pay criminally, former Ombudswoman Conchita Carpio Morales and I submitted a communication to the International Criminal Court on March 13, 2020, to show that President Xi Jinping, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and former Chinese Ambassador Zhao Jinhua, among others, committed crimes against humanity for destroying the marine wealth and food security of Filipinos in the West Philippine Sea. This case is a work in progress as we will address the concerns raised by the ICC prosecutors regarding ICC's jurisdiction. Second, to make China pay monetarily, Philippine authorities have the right to seize assets and properties owned by China's state or owned by Chinese state in the Philippines in order to satisfy China's debt to the Filipino people. Included in these possible assets are the Chinese government's interest in the national grid of the Philippines and China Telecom as the third telco in our country. China can be held accountable here in our country, and our Philippine government, as representatives of the Filipino people, need to stand up for our legitimate rights. The lawful seizure of Chinese assets in an injured state's jurisdiction to satisfy what China owes for damages should be considered also by Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, which are primarily similarly affected by China's wanton environmental destruction. It should furthermore be considered by others like the United States, Australia, and Europe, which claim to have been injured by China in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, I respectfully call on our government to listen to its people. Survey studies consistently show an almost steadfast belief among the Filipinos to fight for what is ours. In a recent SW survey, 9 out of 10 Filipinos believe that the Philippines should regain control of the artificial islands in the West Philippine Sea. 9 out of 10 Filipinos believe that the Philippines should strengthen its military capability, especially its navy. And 8 of 10 Filipinos believe that the Philippine government should raise the issue of the West Philippine Sea to the United Nations and ASEAN as a starter. As representatives of the people, it is incumbent upon our government to uphold the wishes of Filipinos. It is also time for us Filipinos to protect ourselves from China's continuing predatory and abusive practices. Despite China's clear disrespect of our country's rights, our government continues to welcome China, while other countries such as Australia, Japan, India, the US, and the European Union recently enacted measures to prevent China from taking over their strategic and vital industries, like energy, technology, and media telecommunications. After the economic contraction brought by this COVID-19 pandemic, wealthier Chinese investors are eyeing a bigger slice of Manila and our country by taking advantage of a price drop in real property and company valuations. As we gather here today to remember the terrible incident of FB Gemver 1, we should not forget the lessons of our history. Since the 1980s, China has been illegally seizing from Filipinos parts of the West Philippine Sea like Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, and Scarborough Shoal. These reefs and shoals are irreplaceable and have immense economic and strategic value belonging to generations of Filipinos. Filipino authorities should respond by lawfully seizing China's assets in the Philippines. When our government finally listens to its people, when exactly will our government finally listen to its people and stand up for our legitimate rights? And so, ladies and gentlemen, please be safe and please be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario, for those strong words. You are always an inspiration when it comes to, and an inspiring voice rather, when it comes to issues related to China and the West Philippine Sea. And I'll now take us on to the next part of our program. But before I do, I just want to tell the participants that you can actually use the Q&A function of the Zoom meeting. It's that button at the very top, if you're using an iOS device anyway, where you can type in your questions and the team will be able to read the questions and we'll try to answer them as best we can during the open forum towards the end of the vRTD. That said, I will now move on to the first part. We're calling it part one of two parts that we're having this morning. And part one is titled Unpacking the Gemver Incident, Its Implications to the PH National Security Interests. So in this part, in part one, the incident of the Gemver ramming in the early morning of June 9, 2019 showed the clear, unfriendly acts China is capable of. It also shows the lack of response on the part of the Duterte administration by opting to appease China. With the uncertainty of China's security agenda, it is important to understand the different perspectives that come into play when understanding the emergence of China's influence in the region. For this segment, we have two speakers. The first is Attorney Chel Jokno, who's the Dean of the De La Salle College of Law, who's here to discuss with us, in retrospect, implications of the Gemver incident to the Filipinos. Attorney Jokno? Let me see. Yes.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for this invitation. I look forward to this discussion. It's about time we go back to the issue of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. You know, it's been a year since the Gemver incident happened, but it feels like it's so long ago. I think under this public health emergency, our sense of time has also been affected. And we tend to think in two respects, either pre-COVID-19 and in the quarantine. But we have to remember that there are issues that are beyond the pandemic, issues that will affect us for many, many years. And this is one of them. So it's a good idea to really do this. It was a year ago, June 9, 2019, in the middle of the night, in the deep of the West Philippine Sea, that 22 fisher folk who were sleeping aboard their small fishing vessel were rammed, their ship sank, and then abandoned by a Chinese commercial fishing vessel. If not for the kindness of a Vietnamese in a passing ship, I don't know if these 22 fisherfolk, Filipino fisherfolk, would have made it out alive. One would think that this incident would have had profound ramifications on the relations between the Philippines and China. Of course, it did spark a lot of public outrage in our country, but it seems that the government was not swayed by that public outrage and really didn't do much in terms of changing any of its policies as far as Chinese incursions into our territory are concerned. On the one hand, perhaps they did not rethink it, but perhaps what they did was even to go to the opposite direction in terms of allowing more intrusions into the country rather than less. The one thing we can be sure of is that instead of pushing back, as I think many of us wanted, the government ended up opening the doors even wider to this kind of intrusion, and of course to surrendering our territorial sovereignty. And that brings me then to the first implication of this incident, that it would appear that when it comes to our territorial sovereignty, when it comes to the welfare of our fisher folk who live really off the West Philippine Sea, the government doesn't really consider this as one of its priorities. We are getting a sense from what happened not just to the Jember vessel and to our fisher folk in that incident, but to succeeding incidents that we've been monitoring, that the government really is lukewarm as far as protecting our own interests is concerned in that part of the country. This incident also shows how easy it is for at least some of those in government to engage in mental and verbal acrobatics just to be able to justify their inaction or their passivity as far as our relations with China are concerned on the issue of the West Philippine Sea, despite the victory that we secured in the arbitral tribunal. It seems that the goalposts continue to move all the time. And while there was some hint of condemnation on the part of the government at the beginning, they suddenly seem to concede, walk back and downplay what happened in that incident and in succeeding incidents. So moving on from the first implication, I think the second implication is that if the government does not consider this issue as one of its priorities, then it falls upon us, the people, to push them to do so. It falls upon us to do everything in our power to get our government to rethink its policies and to do more in terms of protecting our territorial sovereignty, in terms of protecting our fisher folk, in terms of making sure that we keep what's ours and we protect what's ours, not just for today, but for future generations. But I would say that the challenge is quite a big one, because it's not just a matter of having public opinion. I think there's a lot of strong public opinion against what's happening in the West Philippine Sea, against the intrusions of China, their construction of artificial islands, and so forth. But at the same time, the challenge is for us to harness that public opinion into a leverage, into the pressure that will be listened to by the government. Because after all, and this is, I think, part of what we have to do, we have to make sure that people know, and we must make sure that our government hears and understands that the issue is not just a little issue. What the issue here is an issue of food security. The issue here is an issue of our territorial sovereignty. And the issue here is really about the livelihood of so many of our brothers and sisters who rely on fishing in that area in order to live. Now, having said all that, it is perhaps an opportunity as well. It is an opportunity for us to educate, raise awareness within the country, to get more people on board, but even to go outside the country, because we have to understand that we have natural allies among our neighboring countries who have been much more vocal in terms of resisting the kinds of intrusions that we have experienced here. And if we could join hands with them, if we could work in tandem with these other countries, for example, we must say that Vietnam is one of those that has been very vocal about this issue, then we could work on this issue as well on the international sphere. Because if you think about it, if we continue to do this simply as a bilateral matter between the Philippines and China, it is like we would be, if we, in terms of negotiations, we don't have much bargaining power on a bilateral basis. But if we were to approach this from a multilateral basis, then I think that we would have much, much more leverage, and it would be a bit easier for China to listen to what we're saying. Right now, I don't think they have really given a deaf ear to anything we've said, and even what we've said, even if what we've said is very lukewarm, and even if our government's not really been very vocal about it. As we remember what happened to our fisher folk a year ago, as we look as well forward to commemorating Independence Day in a couple of days, I think Gembear can be both a reminder and it can also be a spark. It should make us remember one thing, and this is the message that we should be delivering to our government, to those in power, that we will not forget, and that whether they like it or not, their day of reckoning will come. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you, Attorney Jokno. Next up, we have our next speaker who will be discussing the Duterte administration's independent foreign policy. Our next speaker is Richard Hyderian, who's here as a non-resident fellow for Stratbase ADR Institute. Richard, you may speak.
Oh yeah, sorry, you're the boss. Just kidding myself. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I think this is perhaps the future webinar. And I'm glad many people positively responded when I posted about this event on social media yesterday. There was a lot of excitement, it seems. I think people are asking for something like this. Lenin, the founder of Soviet Union, said something like, sometimes decades go on and nothing happens, and sometimes weeks go on and decades happen. And I think the first thing that I want to discuss here is what kind of roller coaster the first 6 months of this year has been, and what are the implications for the Philippines. I remember very well when I was in China, Hainan, last year, December, one of the top discussions that was there was how will China cope with multiple challenges in 2020. And in fact, President Xi Jinping himself in one important speech talked about the so-called gray rhinos of economic stability and black swans of unforeseen crisis. So there was already a sense of dread and foreboding in China. And the fact that Vietnam was expected to actually mobilize the region more ferociously on the question of South China Sea, I think was creating a lot of concern. And I remember a Chinese diplomat asking me, this is just after President Xi Jinping launched the Shandong aircraft carrier in Sanya, Hainan. He was asking me, what do I think about the Malaysian submission of extended continental shelf in the United Nations. And then we saw also in January that Indonesia was also more aggressively pushing back against China, and President Joko Widodo actually visited the area close to the disputed areas of the Natuna Islands. So I think many of us, once we saw the COVID-19 epidemic kind of getting out of control in Wuhan and China had to shut it down, I think there was this kind of premature sense of, okay, this is it. China is going to get humbled. China is going to be a little bit more conservative about its policy in the region. Perhaps President Xi Jinping will have to more focus on a domestic crisis, including an economic crisis, which is something very important for China, which is because it's a performance-based regime. And yet here we are. By around March of this year, in one of my articles, I was researching and I went through Global Times, I went through China's state media, And I was really astonished to see that China was beginning to conduct large-scale naval exercises, including with its first aircraft carrier, which used to be named Variag. And then from then on, in fact, it was around mid-March, where I noticed, and I've been writing about this over the past 3 months, we see really naked strategic opportunism on the part of China. I think if there were any illusion about what kind of power China is and what kind of power it will be for the rest of 21st century, if everything is held as constant, I think this is it. I think we thought that with the pandemic, geopolitics will be put to the back burner and people will focus more on cooperation. And yet what we saw was as soon as China contained the crisis at home, particularly in Wuhan and in the Hubei province, and as soon as this spread across the world devastatingly, China noticing that its rivals and its neighbors are scrambling and are distracted, then it began really to push the envelope very aggressively beginning in mid-March onwards. And I think this is where anyone who will argue that China's rise is going to be purely peaceful and that we have a misunderstanding about China, that we're demonizing about China, I think the facts are staring them in the face like never before, like even in the midst of this crisis. And I think if everyone remembers very well the response to the Iisang Dagat video that was uploaded by the Chinese embassy on YouTube, I think it should get the Guinness record for the most lopsided response. It got 140,000 dislikes in a matter of 2 or 3 days. And it's because I think ordinary Filipino people were just not buying it. This idea that China, through its face mask diplomacy or health Silk Road, is helping the world, and it's a benign power and it's a brotherly country calling for a harmonious order. No one was buying that in the Philippines. And I think a lot of countries are not buying that across the region. But at the same time, the reality is that on the ground, things are been working in China's favor. If you look at the alignment of forces, if you look at China, it noticed that the Pentagon, for instance, its main aircraft carrier, USS Roosevelt in the Indo-Pacific, had to be grounded, that it had to suspend foreign deployments for at least a month, if not more. And in the Philippines, we had our AFP Chief of Staff and our Interior Secretary, General Anyo and General Santos themselves, catching the virus and having had to quarantine themselves, among other senior officials. So China was really exploiting that situation. So this is quite a roller coaster, but at the same time, I think it should have served as a wake-up call for everyone who was forwarding a much more naive portrayal of China as a peaceful giant that we have to deal with very delicately and we should not demonize. And in fact, this is a very much rhetoric you get from President Duterte and his supporters in the country. Now, which brings me to the second issue. I think the situation was so bad that President Duterte himself had to reassess his policy, particularly on the visiting forces agreement. A lot of us were very skeptical if President Duterte would really push through with getting rid of the visiting forces agreement before the March finalization of the 180 days operationalization of the abrogation notice. But I think what was happening in the South China Sea really forced President Duterte's hand. And the thing is when you talk about independent foreign policy, to begin with, this is enshrined in our constitution. Every Filipino president has to do that as a matter of national duty, as an architect of foreign diplomacy. So this is not something unique to President Duterte. But what's unique to President Duterte is how he has interpreted independent foreign policy as minus US plus China. And I think the situation on the ground has been so severe and has been so sobering that even President Duterte and top officials within the government were eventually convinced to reverse course on the issue of visiting forces agreement. It also shows how difficult it is to have a dynamic foreign policy, because this is not just about being independent, but it's about getting the most out of your friends and using your friends, leveraging your friends to checking the worst instincts of your rivals. And as far as the South China Sea is concerned, the United States is not a rival, but China clearly is a rival. And it also tells you a lot about the fact that perhaps we don't have a Duterte administration independent foreign policy, but we have Duterte administration's different versions of foreign policy, if not President Duterte himself having different understanding of what's happening on the ground. So clearly, as far as President Duterte is concerned, there's not much coherence to his approach to the South China Sea disputes. And which brings me to the third point. And the third point is this. Again, President Duterte and his supporters have been arguing that the arbitration award of 2016 was completely useless, or at the very least, it was not really a plus for the Philippines. And that's why it's better for us not to emphasize it and not risk antagonizing China. But very interestingly, if we look at the developments over the past 2 weeks or so, both Indonesia and the United States have submitted nota verbales to the United Nations Secretary General Guterres and quite explicitly invoke the Philippine Arbitration Award. My only thing is, did they have to wait this long? I mean, how I wish, particularly in the case of Indonesia, and even Malaysia, if you look at their extended continental shelf claim in the UN last December, it's somehow indirectly, and particularly in the statements of former Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah, they made it very clear that China's 9-9 has no basis in international law, and they were indirectly referring to the Philippine Arbitration Award. My point is, why did they have to wait this long? But better late than never. And I think what Indonesia is doing, what the United States is doing, and hopefully what Vietnam will do soon, will kind of be a reminder to the Duterte administration and a lot of folks who do not understand the nuances of geopolitics. Absent the arbitration award, we have no leverage with the Chinese. The arbitration award gives us significant leverage, and guess what? The leverage is being used by other countries. The other issue, I think, in terms of post-COVID-19 order, I'm going to wrap up soon, is the growing concern over China going from BRI to bargain hunting, right? So for a long time, there was a discussion about debt trap, that China is going to flood different countries with investments. I was always skeptical about that because I watched what China did in the Middle East and Central Asia, where it promised tens of billions of dollars and barely a few $billion really came in. So I was really skeptical about the debt trap in a sense that we'll be overwhelmed by Chinese investment. But my worry in the final years of President Duterte, he's already in his legacy years, is that China will push for bargain hunting. And President Duterte last April, he said something like, the economic situation is so desperate that we might need to sell certain state assets. And if you connect those two, you're going to be a little bit concerned. I think we have to really be vigilant about the possibility that China will go bargain hunting in countries like the Philippines, which are desperate to raise funds to reboot their economy. Our economy has been hemorrhaged because the lockdown was, for me, far too long, just as the public health policy was far too ineffective. So the bargain hunting issue is an important thing. And I'm very glad that Secretary Del Rosario mentioned the fact that in NATO countries, in Japan, they have been pushing for all sorts of restrictions on Chinese acquisitions and bargain hunting in their strategic sectors. I'm yet to see any kind of sense of urgency and awareness on the part of this administration when it comes to this very crucial issue. You see, back in 2010, our concern were the 11th hour midnight appointments of the Arroyo administration. My concern right now is midnight 11th hour bargain hunting by China before President Duterte steps down in 2022. And that brings us to the, I think the last and important issue is that now that we're in the legacy year of the president and we're around 1 year from the more or less informal beginning of the 2022 presidential elections, it is very relevant for us to set the term of the discussions. Unfortunately, 4 years ago, when President Duterte came in and talked about the South China Sea issue or West Philippine Sea disputes, I think not many people were aware of the nuances of the issue, so they easily believed the president when he said, oh, US is unreliable, China is going to be friendly, let's just be nice to them and everything will be fine. 4 years in, I think the Filipino people have a much more nuanced and a sophisticated understanding of the developments on the ground. And in accordance with that, I think we have to push also for a smart, intelligent, and patriotic national debate about what we should do post-Duterte presidency so that the successor of President Duterte will really watch out what he or she is going to do, because the post-COVID order is going to be extremely anarchic and uncertain.
Sorry, I think you're cutting out a bit.
Yep. So that's it perfectly. 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hi, Richard. Yeah, the last part was a bit choppy, but yeah, I'm glad you got all your points in. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, your take on that. I have learned in the past that I really have to move these things along if we want to meet the program time. So if you don't mind, I'll move on to part 2 of our discussion. Thank you, Richard. Part 2 is called the blurring line between traditional and human security. So recent developments in the South China Sea demonstrates China's ability to take advantage of human security crisis to further its ambitions in the disputed waterways. With the evolving nature of security threats, it's important to understand the interplay between traditional and human security threats in the region. This will allow the Philippines to examine its national security agenda and institutionalize a better system to respond to the emergence of various security threats. Our first speaker for this section is Mr. Chester Cabalza, the Executive Fellow and Vice President for Research at the Development Academy of the Philippines. Mr. Chester Cabalza will be discussing with us today a segment called COVID-19 Beyond the Health Emergency. So Chester, please, may I pass the floor on to you? Let me see. You're here, but you're on mute, Chester. So if you could please unmute yourself, perhaps, so that we can hear your voice.
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you to the organizers of the Stratbase ADRi for this opportunity to share my views on how COVID-19 exposed the weak critical infrastructures of the country and related consequences from these, and in understanding the human face of human agenda and how the Philippines perform in this field, specifically on health security. The game changer COVID-19 pandemic reoriented our human species of the biological and social evolution that is clear for the survival of humankind. From the anthropological security standpoint, using Darwinian's complexity of the survival of the fittest, it is common that it's not the strongest species that survives or the most intelligent, but the one most responsive of change. Speaking of change, the COVID-19 outbreak in the Philippines did not only change how we should transform our weak public healthcare system to achieve a gold standard for universal healthcare system, at least in the same level as to what our neighbors had marvelously done or achieved during the pandemic, like what Taiwan and Vietnam done to protect its people from dying from coronavirus. And this pandemic is beyond the health emergency that the Philippines in particular has failed to repair critical infrastructures for health security that underlies one of the premises of human security. The June 9 Reed Bank incident not only dwells on our national security in general, but it also encompasses human security aimed at protecting our welfare of our Filipino fishermen as part of our national interest. The freedom to fish in our own maritime domain is inherent in our rights as Filipinos. But the volatility of security architecture in the region illustrates the blend of both danger and opportunity prompted by overlapping claims of competing claimants in the South China Sea, and also with Manila's closeness with Beijing. The wreck-to-bank incident last year is an attempt to drive away Filipino fishermen in order for China to strongly set foot in the Spratly Islands. By magnifying episode of maritime conflict, Beijing always exerts hard power, while Manila also exerts soft power through diplomatic protest. China's success in building the seawalls contributed to the massive terraforming accomplishments that voice up in the expansive Chinese lake, conjoined by militarized acumen and economic perspicacity. But the number of grievances with China's belligerent militarization and hostile behavior using its Coast Guard and paramilitary or the white ships and militia boat itself become a strong reminder of echoing the Philippines' unfinished business and asymmetry of defense and security bilateral relationships, at how China treats the Philippines despite the landmark decided case it won in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the July 2016 at The Hague in the Netherlands. Our Department of National Defense and the Armed Forces of the Philippines can be strategic and always is strategic in building scenarios and protecting our claimed territories in the West Philippine Sea and Philippine Rise and the Benham Rise against the People's Liberation Army. However, complication of the promising close relationship of Beijing and Manila seem challenging at the same time. Historically speaking, the armed forces of the Philippines have long viewed China as an enemy. The evolving defense ties crosses through baffling circumstances as to get warm with China. The Philippines have to come to some kind of accommodation and agree to China's expansionist maritime and naval ambition, occupying reefs in entirety of the South China Sea, when the mandate of the Philippine military is to protect national sovereignty in all areas. While our independent foreign policy is inclined to soft pedal the maritime and territorial dispute, often pronounced through baffling rhetoric that China is already in possession of the contested waterway, with some eloquence that defeatist statement is tantamount to complete surrender of Manila's claims that, in spite of the groundbreaking maritime ruling that proceeds to a conclusion that China violated the Philippines' sovereign rights in its exclusive economic zone and held the big neighbor interfered with Filipino fishermen. The escalating dispute certainly has helped galvanize tough anti-Chinese sentiments among Filipinos, in which Richard already mentioned about it, not so much with other dimensions of people-to-people engagements, cultural, trade, and economics, but more so now on health security and continuous naval aggression and standard operating procedures or business as usual approach of China in the South China Sea, which is somehow questionable and unethical amid the pandemic that originated from Wuhan. But as China tries to venture on soft power as an instrument of its centuries-old strategic culture to flex its own concept of comprehensive national power, during the zone lockdown in the Philippines, China spreads a message of unity through the Chinese coronavirus video, which Richard also mentioned earlier on, that received dislikes from Filipino netizens, a flack in propaganda, and can be presumed as schizophrenic behavior on the part of Beijing, that while they offer clinical aid on COVID-19, at the same time, they aggressively maneuver their military expansion on the South China Sea. China's foray into aviational underpinnings, an apex of the current geostrategic commanding heights, we struggle to reduce health and medical liabilities, perennially voiced out by Chinese Gulf War diplomats and strategies. We can obviously observe this as a strategy of China's manipulation of its unsuccessful soft power appeal in the region that represents a dissonance between image and action. The pandemic is a step backward for China's acceleration of soft power, and it is hard to sell an image that is benign and benevolent at the same time. It is also believed that as China aggressively spends billions of dollars to improve its international image, it has yet to see a marked return on its investments in soft power. Meanwhile, the assertive solidarity expression made by the Philippines and Vietnam last April 8 against China's standard operating procedures in nearly patrolling all the claimed maritime domains in South China Sea has led to a recent tactical ramming and sinking of Vietnamese fishing boat by Chinese white ship amid the pandemic. Now both Southeast Asian nations experience similar intimidation and coercion by a regional naval power. And this should not be the behavior of a respected regional power. This is how critical interpretative analysis matter in understanding China's hard and soft powers exuded in the Philippines. By June 12, we will be celebrating again our Independence Day. The question is, from anthropological security perspective, are we really free from naval powers? All colonial powers that colonize our country are obviously naval powers. From Spain, the US, and Japan, China has arrived as an emerging naval power. It has set foot on our shores despite our so-called independent foreign policy. But how much independence can this foreign policy willing to sacrifice for the Filipinos at the expense of our fishermen who are part of our national interest, who cried for help when they were accidentally rammed by the Chinese fishing vessel? Our country constantly thinks of deterrence, the state of mind brought about by the existence of a credible threat, of an acceptable counteraction that must exude power projection or the ability to apply or some of our country's elements of national power to rapidly and effectively deploy and sustain forces in and from multiple dispersed locations to respond to crises and contribute to deterrence while enhancing our regional stability. The purpose of the armed forces of a small state is not to wage war, but to avert it. There is a significant difference even if the task of war prevention implies a credible ability to fight. In naval strategy, the main reason for this is that a small state cannot hope to achieve victory in war in the strictly military sense. Instead, the purpose of the war is to end it on unacceptable terms. The armed forces of the small state contribute to averting war first, by maintaining the sovereignty of the state and by enforcing national jurisdiction in peacetime in an efficient and credible manner. The armed forces are an instrument of the state in crisis management and not least of their deterrent effect. Deterrence works when the cost of armed aggression in the mind of potential aggressor seem larger than the benefits of going to war, so that in the end it decides to keep the peace. In this perceived aggression in the South China Sea, amid the pandemic, intimidation and militarization in the world's busiest sea lanes will never become an immediate solution. Lastly, for my point here, the acceleration of multilateralism, which Ambassador De Rosario mentioned earlier on, in crisis management in the South China Sea, should form a broader coalition to impose diplomatic and economic costs to transgressors of normative maritime laws. There is so much to be done here. It should not only be the major powers in the region that will resolve to this highly political insecurity issue, as if the South China Sea issue is only a China-Philippines or a China-US problem. If that's how we see it, certainly China will win in this competition. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Chester, for sharing your perspective and your insight on COVID-19 beyond the health emergency. Next up, we have Mr. Dr. Deo Florence Onda, who's an associate professor and deputy director for research at UP Marine Science Institute. Dr. Onda is here today to discuss environmental threats and opportunities in the West Philippine Sea. Dr. Onda, the floor is yours. Dr. Onda, you are on mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
There. Okay. Thank you again for the ADRi for the invitation. I was asked first to discuss about the destruction and as a result of the activities of the Chinese in the West Philippine Sea. But actually looking back and then being more updated of what has happened or what has transpired in the past few months, I thought that there are actually other things that are pressing right now in the West Philippine Sea. And I call this the fourth phase, the new challenges in the West Philippine Sea. So I'll be focusing more on not just on the destruction, but actually the implications of what is happening right now in the West Philippine Sea. I just would like to remind everyone that when we talk about the West Philippine Sea, we are actually talking about 40% of the territorial waters of the Philippines. It encompasses the waters from Batanes to Batangas, so actually Kalayaan Island Group to Balabac. And so that's the entirety of the West Philippine Sea. It has high biodiversity, it is rich in fishing grounds, it has diverse ecological resources. However, for these discussions, I will only be focusing on the Kalayaan Island Group because much of the activities have been happening in that area. The Kalayaan Island Group is found in the west of Palawan, the offshore areas, and it is ecologically important primarily because of its supposed importance as a source of larvae for different organisms and its ecological connectivity to the rest of the archipelagic country. It is also not a secret anymore that the activities of China has led, several activities of China has led to the degradation of the area, including poaching and illegal harvesting, overfishing and illegal practices, artificial island building, unregulated marine scientific research activities. I think this is something that we haven't really talked about that much, the unregulated MSRs, and I will be talking about the implications of this later. You know, in the past year, we've been bugged with the question, how much does it cost? How much is the cost of the destructive activities that China has done in the West Philippine Sea? And we realized that we really don't have much data to answer, to give a definite answer to this. We can only speculate, as what Ambassador has Del Rosario mentioned earlier, that it was just an estimate, primarily because we haven't really quantified how much has been damaged in the West Philippine Sea. And that actually is associated with the limited research and limited access that we have in the area. Imagine for the Marine Science Institute, which is the National Center for Marine Scientific Research in the country, we were only able to do 8 major expeditions, which were just 1 to 2 weeks long at a time in the past 26 years. And this only happens 1 to 2 weeks per year. So what we are getting are just snapshots of what is happening in the West Philippine Sea, but did not really have a holistic or more general view of what has happened and what is happening in the area. This has implications on answering how much diversity has been lost, to what extent this destruction or damages have implications on the resources of the country? When are the consequences of this going to happen or going to manifest? How? So we are very limited on the understanding of the implications and the impacts of these activities. And it is actually very scary because the lack of understanding actually put the country in a very vulnerable position, since we are already losing resources and facing problems at the same time that we haven't really fully understood. And that limitation is very much associated with the challenges that the scientific community, or at least the marine scientific community in the Philippines, is actually experiencing or experiencing right now. One is capacity for ocean research. We are very, very limited. Their science is also not priority in the floating vessels we have right now. Funding for expeditions is very limited, especially for research. Expertise is also very limited. For a country that is 82% water, we only have a couple of oceanographers around. And for me, this is the most important thing. There is a lack of long-term foresight and plans for research and development in the West Philippine Sea. Much of the talk about the resources in the West Philippine Sea has been focused on fisheries and food and corals and clams. But in reality, there's more at stake. It's not just this food or fisheries that we are losing. And China understands this very well. China understands very well the full potential of the area, not just for food, but also for medicine, biotechnological and medical resources, ocean energy, rare metals, oil probably, and then other resources. And this is the reason why China has actually invested in establishing new research stations in the area, in the Nansha Islands. In the past 2 months, they've just launched 2 other stations, the Yongshu Station and the Zubi Station. They now have 3 total stations in the area, including the Meiji Reef Station that was established in 2018. It is being operated by the Chinese Academy of Science. And they've established a new center for this, the Integrated Research Center for Islands and Reefs. So these centers, their main objective is to be an offshore experimental base to solve science and technology problems on the ecological environment, resource utilization, and sustainable development of the South China Sea. So China is really gearing towards exploitation, exploration, and utilization of the resources, whatever is left behind after what they did in the past years in the South China Sea and also in the West Philippine Sea. The research stations are also there to support studies on ecology, geology, environments, materials, and marine energy utilization in the tropical marine environment. So therefore, China actually sees what the Philippines is not seeing. We are very much focusing on the fisheries or what is floating around, but they are interested on what lies beyond the surface, what is underneath, what is actually in the seabed. And that's something that we should be worried about. They are also now, well, for many years now, they've been publishing these papers and their research in a journal of tropical oceanography, which they are also supervising. And it just tells us, and if you go into that journal, you will see that there are already a lot of studies done in the South China Sea and also in the tropical area of the South China Sea, including the west of the Philippines and the West Philippine Sea, on geology, microbiology, biotechnology, medical possibilities for biodiversity. So it is actually a systematic exploitation and utilization of the resources that we have in the West Philippine Sea and also the South China Sea. And just to give you an example, China sees the South China Sea not just for military or trade strategies, but also as a possible food basket. They have now developed and are now rolling out technologies, for example, for offshore aquaculture farms. These are open ocean aquaculture, mariculture technologies. So imagine the limitless possibilities of actually coming up with fish farms in the middle of the South China Sea or in the West Philippines in the Kalayaan Island group. I was in a conference in China before last year around December, and they have been discussing about the potential for seaweed farming in the Stratbase Islands. Also, imagine if they can now farm sea urchins and other high-value products. And these are the products that the Philippines is actually exporting to China. So what will happen to the fisheries production of the country? What will happen to the demand? What will happen to our fisher folks? So it really has an economic implication on our part. This also emphasizes the threats brought about by unregulated MSR activities in the area, and then that research and scientific information as a form of security issue, primarily because they're doing it in the Philippine territory, and their ability to exploit these resources would result in the disenfranchisement of Filipinos, because these resources are supposed to be for the benefit of the Filipino people. I would like to call this recent aggression in the South China Sea as part of the phases of Chinese aggression. You know, there's phase one, which is occupy and exploit, which includes the fishing fleets and the paramilitia. And then you've got the phase two, which is the militarization and reclamation. And then you've got the phase three, where they built more establishments and bases and facilities to solidify their and secure their claims in the area. And I think they're now reaching, or they have entered phase four, which is actually an exploration, utilization, and exploitation of the resources in the South China Sea through research and development. And I think that is something that we need to be concerned about. And if we want to catch up with what China is doing, we also need to answer some of the challenges that we have in our own side, which is the limitation in scientific research capacity. Now I will be sharing you what has transpired in the past year in terms of scientific development for the West Philippine Sea. I think one of the good things that came out of this issue is that the scientists really had the platform to voice out their opinion and for the government to actually listen to them. So the Marine Science Institute has been collaborating with different national agencies to lobby for funds to come up and establish the National Academic Research Fleet. Right now, we only have 2 research vessels. The BRP Gregorio Velasquez of the Philippine Navy and the RV Casarilan of UPMSI. But these are not enough. If we want to understand what is happening all over the Philippines and the archipelago, we need to deploy many vessels around the country. That is the figure that you're seeing on the right side. So we need more vessels. And we were able to secure funding to actually acquire 4 more research vessels. These research vessels, hopefully they become available in 2021. These research vessels will be deployed in the different parts of the country, including the West Philippine Sea. We are also now upgrading the capacity for more expertise. We are collaborating with 32 HEIs and SUCs to increase or ramp up our experts, and then double the warm bodies who will be able to do research. And this is something that we are really pushing for right now, a long-term research and development priority framework for the West Philippine Sea. The MSI has started, the marine scientists have started drafting this framework, which we divided into 3 phases for the next 10 years, which is also aligned with the Decade of the Ocean celebration. The phase 1 really more involves basic research. The phase 2 more on the exploitation, rollout of technologies for aquaculture, mariculture. And the phase 3 in the latter part of the decade would be more on the rehabilitation, stocking, restocking, and then product development of the resources that we have in the sustainable development of the product and products that we have in the West Philippine Sea. So what we need really in the next 10 years for this long-term R&D to happen are not just scientists. We need a lot of other allied experts in different disciplines. We need more geologists, we need more social scientists, we need more policymakers, science-based managers, we need more law experts who are working together with the scientists to come up with a more solid framework on how to move forward with the West Philippine Sea. We need more economists, strategists, we need more educators and researchers. So this just tells us that the Philippines actually right now is in a sea of opportunities. If we want to solidify our claim with the West Philippine Sea, we need to start moving in the direction where we will be able to contribute concrete things, and that would be research, innovation, development, and technologies. So before I end this presentation, I just would like to leave you with this quote. In his deathbed, and the last time I saw him, the national scientist and MSI founding director, Dr. Ed Gomez, told me, Deo, don't give up on the fight on the West Philippine Sea. Don't give up on Filipinos. So I hope the same call would go out to each and every Filipino, that it becomes our task to actually fight for the West Philippine Sea. So with that, I'd like to thank again the ADRi for the invitation, and good morning.
Thank you, Dr. Onda, for sharing your presentation and your thoughts with us today. Next up, we have Ambassador Laura Del Rosario. Ambassador Laura Del Rosario is currently the president of Miriam College. She's also the a former Undersecretary for International Economic Relations at the Department of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Del Rosario will be talking about repositioning the Philippines in the Chinese economic narrative. Ambassador, you're on mute, but the floor is yours. Oh, you went back.
There. Okay,
There you go.
Unmute me. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this roundtable discussion. I will use a slide presentation because sometimes I tend to overtalk, I tend to ramble. So hopefully with the slide, I'll be able to keep myself on track. Okay, when our government softened the Philippine stand on the West Philippine Sea, the reason given at the time, at least the way I understood it, was that we have to avoid a war at sea or an invasion from China. I rolled my eyes mentally because I know that there are many ways of invading a country, okay? The China, of course, uses economic statecraft, and this is less obvious for some people. But if people have been paying attention to the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, it has three components: the physical corridor, we know this, the railroads, the ports, the bridges. What people are not very conscious of are the virtual corridors, the e-commerce, the financial technology, ICT, telecoms, energy grids. I think we know about the energy grids because this has been a discussion also in the past during the Kin administration, and also the telecoms, you know, who should be controlling our telecommunications. And then the human corridor, teachers teaching Mandarin, and then of course Chinese workers in the Philippines, and the Filipino workers in China, who I understand are almost 100,000. Perhaps some people are not aware of this, but I got this figure straight from the Chinese embassy. Okay, so the physical corridor, of course, it uses the 9-dash line as a territory, as a, you know, the parameters and the boundaries, and the string of pearls in Southeast and South Asian region. And then, of course, in the physical corridor, we're involved in the South China Sea. And I did not go back to what other speakers before me have mentioned about the fish protein, and that we need to do our own food security, and then you have to do fish farming, which I think somebody, the Bureau of Fisheries director during the Kin administration, actually proposed fish farms, you know, selling fish farms to other people, except that he did not have time to develop that issue. And of course, the Chinese distraction and so on. Now, if we just go some of these, okay, infrastructure projects, some people have opposed them because they said they're airdrops from China because they bring everything in, the humans, the material, and nobody really benefits from that. And then they give it to us or other countries to pay for. And then it's not true that build and people will come, because sometimes China will choose a site which is, you know, useful for itself, not useful for the country where it's offering it. So there are white elephants in Africa and Sri Lanka, and to pay for the infra projects, China has demanded control over crucial areas, affecting national security, of course. Now, it's worth mentioning that it was Mahathir who demanded a negotiation of terms on projects in Malaysia. And this explains also why it took so long for Malaysia to be a little bit more aggressive in its position in the South China Sea. It had to wait for Mahathir. In fact, Mahathir said that somehow these BRI projects are actually baits for corruption-ridden government. So they take them so that they can get commissions from them. And China knows that. And then, of course, we know in the physical corridor, it need not be said that China is the biggest consumer of energy. And so that's the problem with the Reed Bank right now with us. Okay. So if I go now to the next slide, okay. Sorry. So why are we focusing on the virtual? I want to focus on that because it is hidden. People don't notice it. There are dominant Chinese companies worldwide. We call them the BAT, the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which are really strongly tied with the People's Liberation Army. So how is the PLA present in us? Through Lazada. There are 8,000 workers right now all over the Philippines, and the branches are all over the Philippines, including far-flung villages and small towns. I can speak from experience because our small barangay or small barrio in the farmlands, you know, in between towns in Pampanga, it has a Lazada there. And then, of course, through TikTok, the video application similar to YouTube, which is actually controlled by the PLA. So one time a friend sent me a TikTok video of one of our government officials dancing. Little did they know that TikTok is actually a monitoring device. You know, it's just like YouTube also. So another one, through the virtual wallet or cashless payments. such as QRs, through China's banks and their lending or leasing system, through the use of mobile phones such as Huawei and Oppo. That's why sometimes we really have to hide away our telephones because they can monitor us through these phones. Okay, in addition to that, why should we be afraid of the virtual corridor? Because it can be a propaganda machine to carry the Chinese narrative, to control our minds, to control opinions, and also to find out how our mindsets are, and then they can modify our mindsets so that we become a little bit more friendly. Now, I'd like to mention here that there was a survey done, I think it was done from abroad, to test the Filipinos whom they trust more right now, the US under Trump or China under Xi Jinping. 77% said that they trust the US more despite Trump. Okay, it just goes to show, you know, how right now the Chinese are faring in the Philippines, but it may not last long because they have the platforms, you know, through the various financial, telecom systems that they have with us. They can control big data and data security. They can do data localization, and then of course our data, where do we store them? And then of course we are dependent on them in many ways. So they can use that also. Artificial intelligence is also frightening because now with e-commerce, which needs digital payments, digital payments now use face recognition led by Alipay. Can you imagine if face recognition will be used in the Philippines, you know, for our own wallet, digital wallets? They can easily control us. Then that means we cannot hold demonstrations. We cannot really, you know, express our right, freedom of speech, because people will be monitoring us facially, and then they can control us. That's why I can understand now why people are afraid of the anti-terrorism bill. Okay, and then there are privacy and identity theft issues, and then of course the owner of the technology can really control data, can really control who can proceed with that platform. It can monitor purchases, it can block purchases, it can control transactions, and of course they can use coercion and cyber monitoring. Okay, now, and we have to go now into the human corridor. Confucius Institute teachers, at the beginning I thought there were just 500. Some people say now they have 2,000 spread all over the Philippines. And of course, China gives the scholarships even to government bureaucrats. The national, the NISA was given, you know, scholarships 2 years ago. It's a good thing that they did not get them. So the trips to China for government officials, this is part of their soft diplomacy. And then the Chinese workers in the Philippines for online gaming and other projects. Do they have other roles for China here? And then of course, as I said, our own workers in China. And then of course, because of our economic dependence on China, in a way, we cannot uncouple ourselves from them. So in effect, that we are linked to them. Okay. Now, there are things that we have to work about. We have to think about our strategic location and its relevance in relation to the U.S. What do you call that? In relation to the, you know, power, the conflict, the peer competition in the South China Sea. People are talking about artificial-based weapons. How will the Philippines play a role now if the U.S. and China are going to use AI-based weapons? And at the same time, our own position, Kevin Rudd just reminded people in his speech at the Asia Society. He said that China despises, is contemptuous of weakness. And then it hit me, does China see us as a weak government, as a weak nation? Are Filipinos weak? And then of course we have to look at the fact that we will be involved indirectly because the US-China relations is Taiwan-centered. And right now, I think we just have to look at what is happening in Hong Kong. The Taiwanese are also trying to think what would happen to them. And we have to worry about that. In our strategic location relation to the US, how will we somehow be participating in that? And then how much weight does the SES issue have on US-China relations? How much will it weigh when it comes to, let's say, if push comes to shove, what will the US do? So we just have to realize that the Philippines has to think that the competition between China and the US is a competition among equals. It was Kevin Rudd himself who said, it is not like the Russia-China competition, Russia-US competition. He said, because Russia was relatively weak, but China now is stronger in some ways. Its capital markets are huge, you know, its wallet what they call digital wallets are competing with the credit card companies of the US like Visa and MasterCard. It has a very aggressive development in its technology, its pharmaceuticals, cyberspace, military capability. So what do you have to wait for aside from our own elections in a couple of years? We have to look at what will happen in the US this year. And then also what will happen in China. Will the Chinese or will Xi Jinping be able to get another term? And they said that Xi Jinping is right now the most powerful man on earth. So I just want to end that, and I hope I was able to summarize my concerns on economic statecraft. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Rosario, for that. It was very enlightening and insightful. Next up, we have none other than our very own trustee and program convener for Stratbase ADR Institute, Dr. Renato De Castro. Dr. De Castro will be discussing China's gray zone, utilizing non-traditional security.
Can you hear me now?
Go.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes,
good morning,
can.
ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. And before I start my presentation, let me express my appreciation for ADRi for giving me again the opportunity to express my view regarding this very important topic. My discussion will again start with what happened last year when you have, of course, the incident in the Reed Bank, the sinking of our fishing vessel. But I would link it to other incidents that happened this year. Then, of course, look at it from the wider framework of what you call Chinese gray zone operation, which in a way is linked with what Ambassador De Rosario talked about, economic statecraft. Now let's look at how China basically applies not simply diplomatic, political, but of course it has a military component, which is many Western scholars would call gray zone operation. Of course, everyone is aware of what happened 1 year ago when you have a Chinese fishing vessel suddenly ramming and sinking, of course, a wooden Filipino fishing boat, the FBGM Bear, which was, of course, anchored at the Reed Bank. You have, of course, the Chinese, supposed to be a Chinese maritime militia vessel, ram and, of course, abandoned those Filipino fishermen. Fortunately, of course, they were saved by a Vietnamese fishing vessel. Of course, that's not the only incident that happened this year. In August 2015, Philippine Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana announced the incursion of several People's Liberation Army's Navy ships, warships, in the country's territorial waters in the southern part of the country. Based on an Armed Forces of Philippines report written after a routine maritime domain awareness operation in the southern Philippine island of Tawi-Tawi, the 4 Chinese fishing vessels passed through the country's forward southern backdoor, and it was observed that the ships' sailing pattern appeared to be highly suspicious as they were zigzagging and not sailing straight as civilian vessels should be doing in performing the rites of instant passage. The ship's transit in Philippine waters could not be considered innocent passage because, of course, they followed the curved course. Secretary Lorenzana opined that the Chinese were taunting the Philippines, basically showing to us that they could operate their warships in our territorial waters, and this is because the Chinese warships' automatic identification system, or AIS, was switched off and ignored radio communication from the AFP units that were observing their passage in the Sibuto Straits in Tawi-Tawi. Of course, I would like to mention again another incident that happened almost a week after President Duterte decided to abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement. And this happened on February 17, 2020, when a People's Liberation Army's Navy's corvette directed its gun control director against the Philippine Navy, at the time, of course, our most powerful and newly acquired corvette, the anti-submarine corvette we acquired from South Korea, the BRP Conrado Yap in the Spratlys. While it was on its way to Rizal or Commodore Reef detachment, the PRP Conrado Yap established radar contact with another gray ship, a Plank or People's Liberation Army's Navy's corvette with bow number 514. The Philippine vessel visually observed that the Chinese vessel's GCD was pointed on it. The GCD is a mechanical or electronic computer that continuously calculates trigonometric firing solutions for use to designate and track potential targets and transmits target data direct to the weapon firing crew. The BRP Conrado Yap's crew members claim that the Chinese ship's gun firing mechanism was aimed or directed at the Philippine vessel. If this is simply the case, if the plant's Corvette GCD was indeed pointed at the BRP Conrado Yap, then this is the first time that a planned warship directly threatened a Philippine public vessel in the South China Sea. Those three incidents are not isolated incidents. There are, of course, instances of Chinese gray zone operation conducted against the Philippines, of course, at the time that this government has adopted an appeasement policy vis-a-vis China. Yet for the Chinese, no, you're still a fair game in its gray zone operation. Gray zone operations can be defined as political warfare, and this refers both to the whole of warfare directed at producing political results and to that part of warfare that employs political, diplomatic, rather than the military means to attain political goals of war, even with actual battlefield engagement of either armies or force navies. Of course, gray zone operations are considered measures that apply persuasive force of power to force adjustment in military, economic, and political and cultural relations with other states short of actual war or armed conflict. It involves dividing or weakening the power of the enemies, opponents, and rivals. Gray zone operation blur the lines separating military and non-military platforms and actions, and attribution for coercive actions directed or undertaken to pursue specific political goals ranging from territorial claims and, of course, creating a sphere of influence, thus undermining an international order. Of course, gray zone operation is not new for the Chinese. They have been practicing it even as far back as the period of warring states. It is of course, it was captured by the works of the Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu in his Art of War, to win without actually fighting. In the context of the South China Sea dispute, gray zone operations are actions in the sea that often blur the separation between military and non-military platforms, an attribution for events and often, but not always, undertaking to advance China's expansive territorial claims. Of course, they are conducted to keep Chinese aggression at sea below the level of actual military operation. You don't have missiles being launched. You don't have aircraft attacking other ships. And they are performed behind the cloak of deniability. China would always say, oh, this is an accident. This is not intended. But nevertheless, the impact has already been there. You have been intimidated by Chinese action. In the South China Sea, China is working to achieve nothing less than, of course, subjugation of its neighbors' civilian maritime population, like what happened, of course, by intimidating Filipino fishermen, preventing them from fishing again in the reed bank, and, of course, against their government. And, of course, the goal here is for them to accept willingly Beijing's expansion and authoritarian vision of maritime sovereignty over the South China Sea. In a way, China is waging a maritime insurgency. They, of course, aim to restrict the freedom of navigation, unravel Southeast Asia's maritime order, wherein, of course, the waters in the region are considered as public goods, and, of course, control the waters not only of the South China Sea, but, of course, what they call the first island chain, including, of course, the East China Sea. So what are the other Chinese gray zone operation defense? Going back to 1996, you have the seizure of Mischief Reef. Then in 2012, the seizure of Scarborough Shoal. Then, of course, you have the build-up of artificial islands that have been eventually militarized, deployment of advanced fighter bombers aircraft, using ill-gotten territorial gains as logistic staging hubs for China's Coast Guard and People's Armed Forces militia. And recently, of course, building a new base on the coast of Cambodia that will allow Chinese forces to encircle Vietnam and cut off its sea lines of communication at will. All these actions are, of course, aimed to complicate how targeted states would react. If you react vigorously, then China saying, you're aggressive, you're creating problems. If you don't respond, then you give China the opportunity to incrementally expand its political and military interests. Of course, in our case of our country, Unfortunately, the country's political leaders have downplayed this gray zone operation conducted against Filipino fishing vessels and, of course, naval warships. In the aftermath of June 9 FB Jim Bear incident, President Duterte even adopted and parroted the Chinese foreign ministry position that what happened there was an ordinary maritime traffic accident. It cannot be considered ordinary because, as the Philippine Navy mentioned during that incident, those fishermen were abandoned at sea. They were not rescued. And of course, what happened recently, after Secretary Lorenzana raised some hell regarding the fact that the Chinese action of directing its gun control director against the vRTD Conrado Yap, after some time he dismissed the incident as a routine matter, given that the Chinese Navy has no intention of hurting Filipinos, even after its corvette directed its gun system director against the vRTD Conrado Yap. He even asserted his view that China would never attack Philippine vessels and aircraft passing through the disputed waters. This reminded me, of course, of what happened in October 1962, when Prime Minister Nehru of India said that China would never use force against India because India and China were friends forever. Soon enough, of course, you have that incident. Defense Secretary even believed that the Chinese crew involved in a gun-pointing incident did not really mean harm to the Filipino sailors. Nevertheless, of course, he described the action as offensive. President Duterte has so far remained silent on that incident, but of course, he has constantly warned against going into war with China in his previous speech, when he would often mention that this would lead to the massacre of Filipinos. We don't have the capacity to challenge or fight China. So what are basically the effects of this? Number one, government pronouncement downplaying this incident encouraged China to pursue its gray zone operation against the Philippines, despite the concessions extended by the Philippines, trying to distance the country away from its strategic ally, the United States, and of course, downplaying the victory it gained from the filing the case against China in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Of course, it will lull our people and armed forces on a false sense of security, making them oblivious on the threat presented to the nation by China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea. And this, of course, was raised earlier by a number of speakers. It isolates us from other countries, like, for example, Indonesia and Vietnam, certain degree Malaysia, who are aware they're being targeted by Chinese gray zone operation. And they said, yeah, this is happening. We have been targeted. But instead, the Philippines is playing basically like an ostrich, putting its hand into the soil and saying, no, nothing's happening. China is still, of course, as mentioned recently by the presidential spokesperson, China is our best friend, despite the fact that China has been applying this operation against Filipino fishermen and against the Philippine Navy. Downplaying or ignoring these incidents enabled China to advance its agenda of maritime expansion through distinctly subtle, aggressive actions that do not guarantee serious and effective responses from targeted states like the Philippines. China finds no more need to embark on a major naval operation to control the disputed waters because it has no need so. Chinese has, most of the countries are basically accepted China's maritime presence as a given, and we cannot do anything about it, no less than President Duterte announced it. China will eventually gain virtual control over fishing ground strategic waterways in the South China Sea without triggering outright armed conflicts with the littoral states in Southeast Asia. The essence of Chinese gray zone operation consists primarily neither of words or deeds or action, but of course, more importantly, intentions. China's intention is to win without actually fighting. Victory should be measured through successful military battles nor campaign, but instead it's better to win without actually fighting. Government's inaction regarding China's gray zone operation indeed is making sure that China would win the South China Sea without actually fighting. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a great day. Please stay safe and healthy.
All right. Thank you, RDC. Thank you, Dr. De Castro. Yeah. Next up, we have RADM Romel Jude Ong, retired. He was previously the Vice Commander for the Philippine Navy and Executive Director for Security Reform Initiative. He will be discussing enhancing the Philippine maritime defense posture. Sir, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. First of all, thank you to ADR for inviting me for this webinar. For the purpose of this activity, I'll be wearing my hat as the Professor of Praxis of the Ateneo School of Law.
Okay, sir.
I'm tasked to discuss on the topic of enhancing the country's maritime defense posture. However, to provide the context, allow me to outline China's strategic design from a naval perspective as a starting point. Most of us are aware that over the years, China was able to build up its strategic buffers in the areas surrounding it. And I talk here of Xinjiang, Tibet, their client state, North Korea. However, it is only recently that they have solved the vulnerability of their East Coast problem, where most of their industries and wealth reside. The so-called Century of Humiliation covers tumultuous events such as the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, which all punctuated the idea of foreign incursion, the incursion of foreign powers into their territory. Now, from a naval perspective, they needed to cure the East Coast vulnerability by attaining the four objectives. One is to sea control of their quote-unquote internal seas. And I talk of the North, the East, and the South China Sea, which are inclusive and inclusive of the airspace above it. They need to sustain presence in key features such as Senkaku Island, our Scarborough Shoal, James Shoal, and the Riau Archipelago in Indonesia. They need to ensure continued access to international straits such as Luzon Strait, Mindoro Strait, Balabac Strait, and Malacca Strait. And lastly, they need to either influence, engage, or co-opt key countries such as North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, us, the Philippines, Brunei and Malaysia, as well as Indonesia. All these countries that fall astride the Debunk 9-line. To achieve the first three objectives of sea control, sustained presence, and access to international straits, China's Liberation Army, Navy, and the People's Armed Police has developed the requisite hard power or military power to achieve this. We have the combination of Navy, Coast Guard, Fisheries Militia operating from fixed bases in Hainan, as well as the Paracels and the Stratbase allied groups. However, the airspace is a different matter. They have yet to provide the appropriate land-based aircraft that can establish air superiority on water and a carrier-based aviation capability which is still in its infancy stage. We have seen these actions in Scarborough Shoal, the harassment of our fishermen, and so on and so forth, as well as the passage of the aircraft carrier Liaoning about a year ago at the Cebu Strait, thence exiting at Balabac Strait. However, to attain the fourth objective, China needs to use its sharp power, not soft power, sharp power consisting of diplomacy, propaganda, and using its economic power, which in combination is used to manipulate the policies and influence and undermine the political system of another country. China needs to keep the surrounding countries, I mentioned earlier, friendly to it, if not to destabilize them, to keep them weak, or most importantly, ensure that they do not form an alliance against their interests. In this regard, China's vector for sharp power is its United Front Works Department at home and its embassies and consulates doing the frontline work in the countries they are deployed. This falls under what we call unrestricted warfare. And its vector is what they call influence operations. Now, through influence operations, China desires at some point to establish a buffer in the West Pacific consisting of the countries I mentioned and weaken the alliance with the United States and our claim to the West Philippine Sea, exert influence over our critical sector society to adapt to the Chinese narrative and to have unimpeded access to our natural resources. China's influence operations are being manifested, as mentioned by Ambassador Laura earlier, on the cooptation of our political and economic elites, political parties, and local government units, entry into our college and universities, propaganda disseminated through local and social media, penetration of our telecommunication sector, the acquisition of strategic real estate properties, example, Puga Island, Grande Island, Hanjin, and the numerous beach resorts that dots the West Coast, and access to our ore and mineral, example is nickel. Having laid down the predicate, how do we enhance now our maritime defense posture? First, we need to address the hard power challenge, the problem of China exerting sea control in the KIG, sustained presence in the Scarborough Shoal, and access towards locks or international states, Luzon Strait, Mindoro Strait, Balaba Strait, and Subutu Strait. Now let's address first the long-term track. To wit, the deterrent and sea denial capabilities under the revised AP modernization program are already in the pipeline. But it will take time for us to acquire them, how much more to mainstream these capabilities into the services. And because of the COVID-19 virus, we have to see the impact on our ability to pay for these major ticket items. We need to develop our own defense and shipbuilding industry. The AFP has tried to integrate technology transfer as a consideration in selecting a project opponent, but the major impediment we faced before was that ability of the local industry to absorb new technology and zero investment on our part in R&D or research and development. On the short term, we need to accept the fact that the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea issues requires resources and capabilities beyond what our country can put on the table. We still have our alliance with the US and strategic partnerships with Australia and Japan. But with the internal problems the US is facing now, their political leadership is too distracted to focus their attention to the Pacific. Thus, we need to sustain and expand our strategic partnership with Australia and Japan. We need to look at building a coalition among our neighbors who are affected by the Chinese actions in the South China Sea. When I was still in the Navy, we were quietly studying the possibility of replicating the trilateral cooperative arrangement we had with Malaysia and Indonesia in the South China Sea. We should look at the possibility of engaging Taiwan, our neighbor to the north, who shares concern vis-a-vis China. We need to look for ways to push the envelope vis-a-vis our one China policy for engaging them. And granted that government agencies may be restrained by the current foreign policy construct, however, nothing prevents the academe, civil society, and other stakeholders from pursuing a track to engagement with these countries that have articulated their stake in the South China Sea. Now for the tricky part, how do we enhance our maritime defense posture against China's sharp power or unrestricted warfare? The first critical step is accepting that our television set, your children's school, your favorite newspaper, your social media accounts, your neighborhood, your government bureaucracy, and even your own family is part of the contested battle space, an extension of the contest being waged in the West Philippine Sea. If you accept this, then the menu of policy interventions should include the following. On the propaganda aspect, we need to build public awareness about allowing our Chinese government to influence our youth and future generations by way of access to our colleges and universities. The setup of the Confucius Institutes, the scholarship programs, and even the attempt to influence the curriculum of one of our universities in Manila are case in point. We need to establish an oversight over Chinese schools in our country in order to protect our own Filipino-Chinese communities. We need to mitigate the impact of propaganda to our population, which is being disseminated through local media, government media PTD4, broadsheet advertisements, and the likes of the Isang Dagat video, as well as the effect of sending government media personnel to China for training. We need to mitigate against the possibility of Chinese companies entering our telecommunications sector. We need to demand accountability among our public officials for better oversight and take legal action against government officials facilitating the sale of real estate properties to Chinese entities, and the exercise of our nuanced oversight over our mining sector. in summary, if we want to enhance our defense posture against China's hard power, we must work with our allies and neighbors. If we want to counter China's sharp power, then we should prepare for the national elections in 2022. If we deny our share of responsibility as citizens in preserving our way of life, then we might face an electoral contest not among political parties, but against China's preferred candidates. That ends my notes. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, po, sir. So now, sorry, excuse me. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I wanted to start with, before we go to the open forum, I wanted to start from part 1. We had Attorney Chel Jokno and Richard Haidarian. Then in part 2, we had Dr. Cabalsa, Dr. Onda, Ambassador Lola del Rosario, Dr. Renato De Castro, and RADM Romel Ong. Thank you for all of you for sharing your insights and thoughts with us this morning. Now we will proceed to the question and answer portion of our event, of our talk. I'm happy to say that for the first time in 3 vRTDs, we actually are at the correct time. We're doing good time. So I think we can entertain a few questions so that I can maintain some order, since there have been a few coming in through the Q&A. I'll start with the first one, which was addressed actually to Dean Jokno. But at the same time, before that, Dean, we also have Justice Antonio Carpio here, who's going to give his closing remarks. So I just want to invite you in, po, Justice. If you feel like you want to jump in at any time, just let us know. But anyway, here's the question, po, for Dean Jokno. International law seems international law seems to unfaze China. What has to happen so that international law can be respected by China, or how can it prevent further abuses? Dean Jokno, you have an answer?
Well, I think the answer to that lies in our being able to work with other countries who share the same interests, and to leverage that into having a lot of pressure on China to. They know that they're part of the international community of nations, and I think that is our best approach as far as addressing this problem is concerned. If we can work with our neighboring ASEAN countries, those who also have interests in the West Philippine Sea, and come up with a common stand that is mutually beneficial to everyone involved, I think China will have a much harder time bullying us. But that, of course, will require that our government get on board, and that they understand that this is probably a much better approach than what they're doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jokno. Next, I actually have one for all of us, for anybody who wants to chime in. We had a question here. It says, if we are to lawfully seize Chinese assets in the Philippines, what are the possible responses from Beijing, and how are we to make the country shock resistant to these responses? It's a long question. The second part is, and if we were to take serious consideration of this route, what preparations can we make diplomatically, economically, and militarily? Would anybody like to give it a crack? I think is Richard? Richard wants to give it a shot, but he's on mute. Maybe somebody can unmute him.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Richard, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think there was actually also a question with respect to, specifically addressed to me on the bargain hunting issue. So I'll try to connect this issue of assets, no?
Sure.
Sovereignty.
Go for it.
The United States, for instance, I'm actually glad that Ambassador Del Rosario mentioned that when it comes to BRI, it's not only the hard infrastructure, but it's also the soft infrastructure and other forms. I think we also have to talk about sharp power operations, which has been very much in display in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other places. So, you know, China's influence in the Philippines is multifaceted and multifarious. Now, in countries like the United States, for instance, they have the Foreign Investment Board review. So you have a specific institution that reviews which are the important sensitive sectors. And when it comes to China's attempts at acquisition, which ones could be threatening to the country's national interest. I think we need to have something like that. If I doubt we have anything close to that or it's operating along those lines, but we need something along those lines because we have seen that China's been bargain hunting in different countries trying to gain access in their R&D and some sensitive AI and high technology sectors. In the case of the Philippines, you can imagine China will have an interest in the telecommunications sector, especially in emerging 5G network. And 5G network is a completely different ball game because China is developing what experts call quantum communications. So not only will that allow for for China to block any America's signals intelligence activity against China, kaya nga apektado rin yung intel operations natin, but it will also give China significant level of control over communication flows, no, with the countries who are part of the 5G network. But China could also push, for instance, gaining access to oil and gas exploration fields, for instance, in the West Philippine Sea. Reed Bank could be up for grabs. So their hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, telecommunications sector. So we need something like a Foreign Investment Board review or some sort of a civil society version of that for now to put pressure on the government and make sure that China doesn't go for bargain hunting. So I think that's something that is very important. Now, on the issue of resisting China, I never bought this argument by the government that if you resist China, you know, they're going to be aggressive to us. First of all, the Aquino administration took China to international court, embarrassed them like crazy. And there was no war. There was no GEM-VR situation. They did not sink any of our fishermen when we filed arbitration award against China. So that's complete nonsense. It has no basis in reality. And last year, when I interviewed Prime Minister Mahathir when he was here in Manila, he made it very clear to me that when you get investments from China, you have to make sure that you're not too much fiscally exposed. And at the same time, Prime Minister Mahathir also made it clear that if you stand up to China, push for major cancellation of Chinese investment, you're not going to pay so much of a price. There was no aggressive action on the part of China against Malaysia last year or even this year, even though Malaysia aggressively more or less canceled multi-billion Chinese projects and pushed for renegotiation of a lot of them, bringing down the cost by $6 billion. So if Malaysia, a relatively small country, 30 million population, can stand up to China and pull it off, despite the fact that they're even more economically dependent on China, I don't think there's any reason for this government not to also adopt a much more calibrated and assertive policy. So I think the last thing we want right now is fatalism and self-defeating statements from our heads of states. And especially now that we're vulnerable economically, we have to be very careful about not giving bargain price access to China to very sensitive assets in the Philippine public.
All right, yeah. Thanks, Richard, and thanks for connecting it to that question that was actually for you on the bargain hunting. But before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to check with Ambassador, with ADR, Ambassador Alberto Rosario, if he wanted to weigh in on the question that we had earlier about, and I'll reread the question. If we are to lawfully seize Chinese assets in the Philippines, what are the possible responses from Beijing, and how are we to make the country shock resistant to these responses? Just in case you wanted to respond in any way, Ambassador. You would have to turn your microphone on. Let's there we go. Ambassador?
Yeah, I think the question is, we have been bullied, we have been abused. I think we need to come up with positions that can be considered as a pushback against the abuses of China. I think we have many options in terms of bringing these options to the fore and working them to our advantage, I think we need the government's cooperation. The government should be leading here, to the detriment of the Filipino people. Our government has not been forward-looking in terms of how do we regain control of the various issues which clearly favor us, but because we've decided not to take positions against China, we have to think about where we stand, and we have to think about how we can improve our position. One of the ways that we could do this is, of course, we need, as a first initiative, we would need our government to take the arbitral tribunal from the shelf. Okay. As you said, this is a bargaining chip, but we need to take it off the shelf, and we need to take it to the UN General Assembly to seek help from our allies in order to be able to compel China to honor and to abide by the rule of law. And our victory is one that we are now an integral, the tribunal outcome is now an integral part of international law. I think we should refer to a comment made by an Indonesian diplomat that was published recently about what is the value of the arbitral tribunal decision. And it's really makes a lot of sense, because he says something like, if there's a law, if there's a rule is a rule. Whether people agree with it, it's a rule. Whether people do anything about it or not do anything about it, it's a rule. And if there's no one in the world that agrees with it, the rule is a rule. The rule stands. I think that's very emphatic, and I think it's a very thoughtful interpretation of we need to promote the rule of law, and we need to adhere to it, and we need to get other countries to join us in doing this. We also talked today about seizing assets, which of course is very much a possibility, a probability, it is a viability rather for us to do that. In terms of what we should be doing about China coming in and lowballing proposals to be able to seize our strategic assets, we of course we can legislate the possibility that to ward off the possibility that China may be bargain shopping, as you had said. There are so many things that we can do. For example, we have, you remember, we have taken Ombudswoman Conchita Morales Carpio and I have taken we've sent a communication to The Hague that we are we will be putting to task certain officials for crimes against humanity. And I'm very hopeful that we will be able to move this forward, and we think that this is just several of the initiatives that we'd like to take as the private sector, where it's a way for us to say to the government, hey, look, we're doing something, join us, or let us join you in terms of any initiative that you may believe would work in advancing the interests of the Filipino people.
That's it. Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario, for that. I'm moving on now to, yes, Justice Carpio, of course. Yes, of course.
Yes. In the Arctic Sunrise case, the Netherlands was awarded the damages by the UNCLOS Tribunal for the damage suffered by the Arctic Sunrise when Russia seized the Arctic Sunrise. And Russia paid the Netherlands for the damages. Of course, there was a negotiation, and the Netherlands and Russia agreed that the damages would be paid with 50% discount. But Russia, a nuclear armed state, paid the Netherlands pursuant to an award of damages by an UNCLOS tribunal. In our case, we can go to an UNCLOS tribunal and seek damages against China for preventing our fishermen from fishing in Scarborough Shoal or in Reed Bank or in other areas, or for destroying the marine environment after 2012, after we filed the case. So there will be a ruling by an UNCLOS tribunal on the award of damages, and we can choose to enforce that anywhere in the world where China has assets, in the US or in Canada or in the Philippines. It's part of our legal strategy to put pressure on China that China cannot just grab our resources in the West Philippine Sea. We should not be afraid to do this, because if we are afraid to do this, then we will never be able to defend the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Carpio. Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario. Does anybody else want to weigh in? If not, I'll move on to the next question, which is addressed to Dr. Cabalza. Dr. Cabalza, Dr. Chester, the question here is: the internal-looking security agenda of the Philippines is a hindrance to deterring external threats. Is the national security strategy of Duterte lacking? How else can we address this lack of doctrines and implementation?
Okay. I keep on telling that the Department of National Defense, including the other security sectors, are actually strategic on how they would contain our security threats when it comes to the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. But I think the problem here is quite political because of the execution of the Malacanang. You know, our soldiers and the Navy and including the Air Force are very strategic when it comes to their building scenarios and how they would save our territorial integrity and national sovereignty. But when you look at it, there's a higher echelon of the relationship between Beijing and Manila, because basically our two leaders, the two leaders of specifically Xi Jinping and President Turkey are in a way are exchanging notes, and basically they have good rapport and relationship so far. That makes Washington a little bit envious because of basically of these political geopolitical reasons here. But nonetheless, if we try to look at it, basically based which I told earlier, historically speaking, the AFP couldn't basically give their trust too much with the with Beijing, because basically what we know is that China is is an enemy, and with that kind of ideological thinking, it is so hard for us to basically get so much trust with China, but at the same time also engage militarily with them. And you know, the problem here is not only our relationship with Beijing is a multi-dimensional. people-to-people engagement, culturally, economically, we can basically, there's no so much problem with that. But when it comes to our security and military engagement that becomes a little bit problematic because of some hindrances when it comes to our alliance with them.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cabaza. And does anybody else want to weigh in on that? No, it's all perfectly all right if you don't, because I actually have the next question on deck already. This one is actually for, let me just locate it, for Dr. Onda. What opportunities do you see for international cooperation on MSR and R&D planning?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I'd like to start with the position that MSRs are good. International scientific cooperation are actually good because it updates us with the new technologies. There's a transfer of expertise. It also allows us to actually do more by doing scientific collaboration. The problem comes in when a certain entity goes into our territory and do research activities that did not undergo the vetting process. And as the most important gain that we can have is really, I think this would actually complement the advocacy of Ambassador that he proposed last year for FONOPS, because international cooperation allows freedom of research in areas where it is supposed to be allowed. For example, in the West Philippine Sea, if it has undergone the process of vetting, then international cooperation can actually pursue, and that would solidify the claim of a country that's doing or who's doing research in the area. What are the opportunities for this? There's a lot. The country is in a very strategic position because we have the Philippine Rise, which is a confluence of different oceanographic processes. We have the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea, which is a little understood area in terms of biodiversity, in terms of ocean functions. So you have climate change happening everywhere. You have unprecedented discovery of biodiversity. We are in the center of marine biodiversity, and that makes the Philippines an interesting background or playground for many scientists. So there's really a lot, but I think the most important thing here is all the MSRs that are to be done in the country should undergo the vetting process. It should undergo the process of MSR application. It should always have the local collaboration with the local scientists. With the framework that we have right now, the problem is foreign entities would come in and invite local scientists, but what happens is that the local scientists are just mere observers. It is more of a fulfillment of a requirement rather than a true collaboration. So what we Filipino scientists are fighting for is that we need to be standing on equal grounds. The foreigners coming in, but the scientists, the Filipino scientists actually dictate how the data will be collected and how it's going to be used. So although there are a lot of spaces for cooperation, we should also safeguard the interest of the Filipino scientists as we go along, as we carry out the expeditions and the scientific cooperation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Onda. Next up, we have a question here. Again, the questions usually have people to whom they're addressed, but please feel free to answer if you feel like you want to share some thoughts on it. But the next one I have here is for Ambassador Lula de Rosario. And the question here is, with the global economic recession and increased online diplomacy of China, it is clear that the narrative can easily be shaped with their influence. How can the Philippines, as much as possible, be more informed of the current political and geo-economic issues?
Okay, this is really tough because right now we can see because of the inability, the lack of capacity for the US to lead. They said that now really China is really leading the narrative globally. The problem with us, I think, is because our own people who are knowledgeable, are not given access to the press. And you have commentators, sometimes it frustrates me that I listen to radio and what I call the armchair political scientists and the charlatans are making comments about our political events. And some of them, you just have to figure out whether they are for this or for that. I think we need something like this, constantly being, if we can have something on radio or on TV, so that the experts are the ones who will do the analysis, not the armchair political scientists who have no background, who just read newspapers here and then they connect events. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a nice one. I like that. Next up, we have a question. If you notice, I'm actually following the programs to give everybody the chance to get a question, since there are a bunch. So the next one is for Dr. De Castro. So RDC, the question here, which might also be answered by RADM Ong, if he wishes, is China using their unrestricted warfare doctrine with their activities in the West Philippine Sea in the global stage? RDC? Oh, nope, no, we can't hear you. Still on mute. Maybe somebody from our team.
Elliot, yes, I can talk now.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes,
Dr.
it's unrestricted. It's basically the application of all what we call the whole spectrum of capabilities, ranging from what you call hard power, which of course pertains to the military capability, the naval capability, and of course also involves the soft. Soft includes, of course, economic statecraft, public diplomacy, the mass diplomacy that China is using. But the Chinese are very conscious of the fact that we always have the Chinese approach. Although it involves the comprehensive everything, as much as possible, their preferred approach is to win without actually fighting. That's why I emphasize the point of gray zone operation. All the cards are put on the table, but as much as possible, China wants to win the war without actually using force. That's why every time President Duterte say that, you know, if we challenge China, China will wage war, I think that's far from the intention of the Chinese. For them, the mark of a great warrior is to win without actually fighting. So that in a way, the gray zone operation includes that whole spectrum of capabilities, from mass diplomacy, from composing a song about one sea, then of course Confucius Institute, up to, of course, the deployment of the second Chinese carrier. So that's basically the name of the game, how China is playing that game. Okay.
All right, thanks, Dr. De Castro. RDM Ong, would you, or Professor Ong, since you're here for the Ateneo School of Government today?
Marami akong hats kasi. Anyway, unrestricted warfare is not directed at the West Philippine Sea sa dagat. It's sa lupa. So it's here. It's here in our country, directed. So as has been mentioned earlier, it attacks our political system, our economic systems, our social system. And ang vectors niyan are diplomacy, propaganda, and of course, leveraging yung economy nila against our economy for their own interest. So as I said in my notes earlier, the penultimate unrestricted warfare sa toolkit nila would be interference in political elections. They've done this in Taiwan and they've done this in Korea.
Australia too.
So don't be amazed or that they will do it in 2022 to us. Imagine yung Facebook issues natin were happening on the month of the political campaign in 2022. That will be chaos already. And that's only Facebook. Okay. So if you context that as part of the toolkit of unrestricted warfare, then parang preview na ng what will happen to us 2 years from now. Thank you.
May add, Paco? You know, okay. Romel and I have been exchanging thoughts on this. Some of us believe that there will be more than 2 Manchurian candidates. So whoever they will field, we have to unite under one candidate so that whoever they will field will come strong. The problem is, Even our businessmen, they bet on everybody. See? So they bet on candidate 1, 2, 3, 4 just to make sure that they're safe. But what happens is that you come out with a minority winner. But if we know which are the Manchurian candidates and then we put all our chips behind someone whom we think is strong enough. Remember, as somebody said, I mean, I think it was Rene who said that somehow with the Chinese, yeah, you don't have to fight a war. Remember what was said of China. China has a contemptuous attitude towards weak nations. We have to stand up. That's why when people push back, like Malaysia, they, in a way, they respect that in a way. That's why during the time of Aquino, I think they hated us, but in a way, I think
they respected him.
Yeah, right. For our strength of character, for what we believe in. Okay, enough said by a woman. You might. Okay.
Okay, thank you, folks. Anybody else? I do have a question here for. Oh, did Dr. Cabaza want to say something? No.
Yeah. Can I just
All right, okay.
the conversation here, because basically China is trying to of course to expand their grand strategy in the region, because basically of course there's a competition between China and the US right now. But it seems like the COVID-19 it's like the health gray zone so far. Yeah, as much as possible that we don't want to think that way. But basically they're trying to of course to send their mass diplomacy, and of course the world party or the diplomats there so far trying to convert the kind of narrative that they're giving to the world here. But basically, as part of their instrument of power by exuding their comprehensive national power, in which of course they don't so much subscribe to the hard and soft power, which the Americans are trying to tell to the world. But basically, these are forms of their instrument of national power, where they're trying to influence us with their culture. Of course, we've heard a lot of that with their education and so forth. But basically, if we try to look at it, China it's exerting so much with their efforts on how to influence us, and I think that is very strategic in a way for on the part of China.
All right. Okay. Thanks. Anybody else? If not, I actually have this next question. So we've talked a lot about the situation and how it is. We have a question here. It's more forward-looking. It says, how can we make the best out of our relationship with China, taking into consideration that our current administration's stance on the issue won't change anytime soon, and China has been benefiting more on this? Is there a chance that we can tip the scale to balance the relationship? I'll just throw that question out. Anybody can answer if they want.
Can I react? I think
sure, please.
Just like looking at what happened last week, when suddenly you have the Secretary of Foreign Affairs announcing that there'll be a suspension of the termination process of the Visiting Force Agreement. I think that that surprised the Chinese, because when President Duterte announced that he'll be terminating the listening to the Chinese foreign minister, and then they were elated. Now suddenly you have this reversal in this decision. So I think the point here is, let us not give China that opportunity to say it won without actually fighting. That's putting pressure on the, probably on the to raise this. Probably on the top, you have people here that are convinced that China has basically won the game. But going to the bureaucracy or ordinary papers or diplomats, there are the people there who still believe that we have a fighting chance. So that's basically the role of the civil society, to put pressure on the government. China's concern about the Philippines is not the fact that they could buy the top official. China's primary concern that the Philippines is a wild card. It's a wild card because it's a liberal democracy. So that's basically our advantage. How we could tap that advantage, how we could invigorate the civil society to basically ensure that what policy that the government will come out in terms of dealing with China and the United States, it will always be a content policy. And of course, this was raised earlier by Professor Ong. It's very crucial that we have to ensure that the presidential election of 2022 will be clean and honest. That China should not be able to ensure that one or two Manchurian candidates would get the presidency. So that's basically my take. The bottom line here is, let's not accept China has already won.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks for that, Dr. De Castro. If maybe I could ask a semi-related question to Richard, since Dr. De Castro was already talking about the elections, the upcoming elections. We have a question here. For Richard. With all the inadequacies and inactions of the Duterte administration in handling China, what are the repercussions for the next administration? Or will it be too late for the next admin to undo these inadequacies and inactions? What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm an inveterate, cautiously optimistic person when it comes to this. I think, I've been writing on South China Sea since 2010, at least journalistically and also academically. And I think the fight is far from over. I mean, if this is about boxing and our next president could become a boxer, after all, then we're just in round 4 or 5. There's no knockout or knockdown yet. So I think the first thing that we have to get rid of, and I think good friends like Ambassador Bilahari of Singapore have been stating, is not to buy the Chinese narrative of their inevitable hegemony, right? Never fall for that strategic fatalism that the game is over. In fact, even with the Manchurian candidates that China may try to push forward, whatever we mean by that, even those persons we have to engage in, because at the end of the day, whoever becomes the president of the Philippines, they'll be extremely vulnerable to pressure points, to veto players across the entire spectrum of decision making, right? Even President Duterte, who I think has been the most brazenly China-friendly Filipino politician we have ever had in our history, even he could not completely ignore the pushback internally, the pushback from outside. And I think any Manchurian candidate in 2022, I don't think they'll be as charismatic and as strong-willed as President Duterte on this issue of China, so that even the Manchurian candidates will be very vulnerable to pressure from outside. That's why I'm still cautiously optimistic. But as they say, the best disinfectant is sunlight. So we have to really highlight what is the sharp power threat to the Philippines. I was based in Vietnam as a visiting scholar last year, and we really watched very carefully what the Taiwanese governments did to make sure that they have minimum possible vulnerability to Chinese sabotage, including sabotage of their election process, while at the same time not undermining their civil liberties. So that optimal balance is doable. And we saw in the case of Taiwan, how Taiwan leveraged the Hong Kong crisis. Tsai Ing-wen used the Hong Kong crisis to show that China is not a country that you can deal with fair and square. And I think we should do the same for 2020 elections and point out that even the Chinese in China, the Hong Kong people, even the Taiwanese don't like China. Maybe that should tell us something about how we should keep an eye wide open. So as much as we should welcome optimal economic engagement with China, and I think China has a lot to offer us, we should not ignore that, and that we need to deal with China because unfortunately they are our de facto neighbor right now because of their expansionism in the South China Sea. We have to be eyes wide open and no more of the nonsense argument that if you resist China, there'll be war. That's a complete nonsense. And if there's anything, President Duterte's acquiescent policy towards China has shown that acquiescence does not bear fruit. The situation on the ground has been way worse for the Philippines since President Duterte came into power and since President Aquino has left. So there's no evidence to suggest that playing it nice to China will actually bear us fruit. And we have to hammer that over and over again on the next president, even if it's a Manchurian candidate president, because he cannot deny the will of the people in our liberal democracy.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Oh, did somebody want to add to that? Okay, if not, I think it's a good time. That's a good point to close the Q&A. Thank you all for answering the questions, and for all of our participants who asked them as well. Thank you. I think it's now we've asked. I think at this point we've already asked Justice Carpio to wait quite a while and to listen to all of us talk before letting him deliver his closing remarks for our session today. So I think, yeah. So I think with that, I'll pass the floor on to to former Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio. Justice Carpio.
Thank you, Paco. Good morning to everyone.
Yes,
Let me commend the ADR Institute for continuing to hold fora like this to remind us that we must continue to defend our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Otherwise, in the near future, our fishing boats will not only be rammed in the West Philippine Sea like the FB Denver was rammed 1 year ago, but all our fishing boats, as well as our Navy and Coast Guard ships, will even be barred from crossing China's 9-dash line in the West Philippine Sea. Our dispute with China is clear. China wants to make the 9-dash line China's national boundary in the West Philippine Sea. China wants to seize at least 80% of our exclusive economic zone and 100% of our extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea. That means we will lose a maritime area larger than our total land area. We will lose all the fish, oil, gas, and other mineral resources in this huge maritime area. We, of course, want to defend and preserve our exclusive economic zone and extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea. The strategy of China is clear. China is bullying and intimidating the Philippines into accepting the 9-dash line as China's national boundary. By building huge air and naval bases in the Spratleys, by constantly patrolling our exclusive economic zone with missile-armed frigates and destroyers, by sending swarms of maritime militia vessels to our territorial seas in the Spratleys, by locking our smaller warships to the radar fire control system of their better armed and larger warships, and by ramming our fishing vessels in our own exclusive economic zone, China hopes to intimidate the Philippines into accepting the 9-dash line as China's national boundary. The strategy of the Philippines under President Duterte is also clear. The Philippines will never offend China, and the Philippines will always appease China. The Duterte administration has set aside the arbitral ruling in the expectation of receiving loans and investments from China. We have set aside the arbitral ruling, but the expected amount of loans and investments from China have not materialized. Still, we refuse to conduct joint patrols with Vietnam or Malaysia in each other's exclusive economic zone because we do not want to offend China. We do not welcome the freedom of navigation operations with the US and other naval powers in the West Philippine Sea because we do not want to offend China, even if those freedom of navigation operations are the most robust enforcement of the arbitral ruling. We decline the invitation of Vietnam to delineate our overlapping extended continental shelf in the Spratleys because we do not want to offend China, even if such delineation reinforces the arbitral ruling by state practice. We refuse to file our extended continental shelf claim of the coast of Luzon facing the South China Sea because we do not want to offend China, even as Malaysia and Vietnam have filed their own extended continental shelf claims in the South China Sea. We are shy in using our own arbitral victory to protest China's creeping encroachment of our exclusive economic zone, even as Indonesia uses the arbitral ruling in its diplomatic protest against China's encroachment of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. The Philippines even announced on February 11, 2020, the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement in 6 months' time, as if we do not need any military ally in defending our territory and maritime zones from encroachment by a nuclear-armed China. All of this, of course, is music to China's ears. As the Philippines strategy countered China's strategy, Obviously not. And recent events have only shown how our strategy to defend the West Philippine Sea is in total disarray. China recently abundantly hinted it would soon declare an Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, over the South China Sea. And the response of the Philippines was to suspend the running of the 6-month period to terminate the VFA. When China hinted it will establish an ADIZ over the South China Sea, it only meant one thing. China will very soon put up an air and naval base on Scarborough Shoal, without which an ADIZ over the South China Sea cannot be enforced because of a hole in China's radar, missile, and jet fighter coverage in the northeast section of the South China Sea in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal. In early 2016, China sent dredgers steaming from the coast of Guangdong to Scarborough Shoal. US satellites monitored the dredgers. President Obama called President Xi Jinping that the US would take serious measures if the dredgers proceeded to reclaim Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese dredgers turned back. With the 6 months or even 1 year suspension of the termination of the VFA stopped China from reclaiming Scarborough Shoal. Will the US exert all its efforts to stop the reclamation of Scarborough Shoal, knowing that the VFA will in any event be terminated after 6 months or 1 year? A strong and effective alliance cannot be made to depend on a treaty, as the VFA is a treaty that is terminated on a whim and then suddenly suspended from termination for 6 months to 1 year, with the threat to finally terminate it thereafter. That is not how territorial integrity and maritime zones of a state are defended. That is compelling proof of a foreign and defense policy in total disarray. We are probably just lucky that China's 9-line claim is so outrageous, so ridiculous, so fake, and so destabilizing that despite our erratic and self-destructive policies, our ASEAN coastal neighbors and the naval powers of the world will never accept China's claim to ownership of the South China Sea. Even small coastal states outside our region will oppose China's claim for fear that their bigger neighbors might emulate China and seize their own exclusive economic zones. This fortuitous situation allows the Philippines to muddle through even with a defense and foreign policy on the West Philippine Sea that simply appeases the very state that admittedly intends to seize Philippine territory and maritime zones. Certainly, the Filipino people do not deserve this. This only means that all of us in this online forum today are dedicated to defending the West Philippine Sea to our last breath. We have a long struggle ahead of us. We remain undaunted. We will persevere and we will prevail. Thank you and a pleasant day to everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Justice Carpio, for those inspiring closing remarks. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, all of our speakers and participants for attending today's virtual roundtable discussion entitled Debunking China's New Normal, a year after the readback incident. I'd also like to invite everybody here present to follow our page, Stratbase ADR Institute, and support our future vRTDs, which we will be conducting regularly over the next few weeks. So with that, thank you, and I think we can officially have lunch. No, I'm just close the vRTD, and bye, and see you all next time.
Good day.
Thank you.
Okay, salamat. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.